Adam Zagajewski is a writer of great acclaim. Several of his works, originally in Polish, have been translated all over the world. Among his many accolades, he has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, and one of his more recent works of poetry, World Without End, was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award. These awards speak to his works of poetry, but Zagajewski is also a memoirist, essayist, novelist, and scholar. He currently teaches on the Committee of Social Thought at the University of Chicago and divides his time between Chicago and Krakow. Adam Zagajewski's latest book of poems, Eternal Enemies, feels deeply nostalgic, not only for the past, but for the present moment, for life in the richness of its joys and miseries. Reading these poems is like being seated next to an old companion who, neither of you going anywhere, turns and says, "I miss you." This is what it means to live life in full view of itself, of death. This embrace, this longing for what is right in front, allows for a penetrating look into material detail. The trees that sit in the meadows like priests in green cassocks, the unlovely church with its dust trembling in a sunbeam, a crowd rippling like a jellyfish in water. In Poetry Searches for Radiance, the speaker sums this notion up in the following lines. "Let me see, I ask. Let me persist, I say." To observe is to persist, and the reader finds herself traveling with the speaker through place and idea, to follow the contours of the street, the city, a comrade's aging lips, the great suffering that has already dried on a painting, to travel literally and figuratively, to leave home and to return. All of this is to search for radiance. And it doesn't entirely matter if radiance is found. The search itself is a kind of living. I find these poems imbued with an authentic optimism, an optimism not in denial or distancing of suffering, nor with a perverse love of it. But Zagajewski brings forth a world in which poetry survives suffering and in a way makes use of it. Zagajewski's poems led on to the fact that he's also an essayist. He considers the interrelationship of morality and nature. His poems bear the weight of their historical moment. He reflects on other writers, on humanity, on despair, on the irreconcilable. As an undergraduate, I had the pleasure of hearing him give a talk on what poetry had achieved in the 20th century. I left the talk a bit unsure of what had happened, having only been a serious reader of poetry for, say, 6 months, but with full knowledge that I'd been in the midst of genius. His is the sort of genius that doesn't rest on its laurels. He listens and keeps watch. His antennas are up, even in the rain. In his final poem of Eternal Enemies, he provocatively asks, no, declares, if only we read poetry as carefully as menus in expensive restaurants. If only we gave any poetry as much consideration as Zagajewski's poems give life and us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shira, so much. This was the best introduction ever. I think you've slightly exaggerated, but I think that the poetics of introductions are like this. This reminds me, my father, who had nothing to do with literature, he's still alive, but alas, in a very painful situation now. But he was once asked about his life. He was this retired professor in an engineering college in Silesia in Poland, and he came from Lvov as the entire group of professors came. And so the interviewer asked him about his experience, and at a given moment quoted a few sentences from my essay on 2 cities where I described this. And these sentences are very poetic, and not for my father, but he's kind of down-to-earth person. And so the interviewer asked my father to comment on this sentence. My father said, "Oh, I think slightly exaggerated." I love it because this is how the world of engineers looks at poetry, right? It's slightly exaggerated, but this is what we do. Well, Shira, you are in a good tradition of slightly exaggerating. I'll start with not a poem of mine, but with a poem by Zbigniew Herbert, who, as some of you know, that it's actually Herbert's year. He died 10 years ago, and he's such a big poet in Poland now that the parliament decided that's the Herbert's year. But this is actually not the reason. I don't follow parliament so much. I simply love his work, but also this is where his translators lived, Bogdana and John Carpenter. So I will read a poem, Herbert's poem in the translation from the Mr. Cogito book. Mr. Cogito is an invention of Herbert. The poem is called About Mr. Cogito's Two Legs. The left leg, normal, one could say optimistic, a little too short, boyish, with exuberant muscles and a well-shaped calf. The right leg, God help us, thin, with two scars, one along the Achilles tendon, the other oval, pale, pink, shameful reminder of an escape. The left, inclined to leap, ready to dance, loving life too much to expose itself. The right, nobly rigid, sneering at danger. In this way, on two legs, the left, which can be compared to Sancho Panza, and the right, recalling the wandering night, Mr. Cogito goes through the world, staggering slightly. So now I will read a few new poems, unpublished or just recently published in magazines, and then I'll read a few poems from the recent book, Eternal Enemies, and maybe a few older poems. All depends on timing. So I start with this new poem. It's called Café. And I mentioned here a novel that probably many of you have read, Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. And you remember this is the main character. The consul is an alcoholic who doesn't actually attend the AA meetings at all. And this is the setting of the novel, that's the Day of the Dead in Mexico. Café. In that café in a foreign town bearing a French writer's name, I read Under the Volcano, but with diminishing interest. You should heal yourself, I thought. I'd become a Philistine. Mexico was distant, and its vast stars no longer shone for me. The Day of the Dead continued, a feast of metaphors and light. Death played the lead. Alongside a few patrons at the tables, assorted fates, prudence, sorrow, common sense, the consul, Yvonne. Rain fell. I felt a little happiness. Someone entered, someone left. Someone finally discovered the perpetuum mobile. I was in a free country, a lonely country. Nothing happened. The heavy artillery lay still. The music was indiscriminate. Pop seeped from the speakers, lazily repeating many things will happen. No one knew what to do, where to go, why. I thought of you, our closeness, the scent of your hair in early autumn. A plane ascended from the runway like an earnest student who believes the ancient master's saying. Soviet cosmonauts insisted that they did not find God in space, but did they look? Maybe I'll read now a poem in both languages. The translations of the newer poems are by Claire Kavanagh, but this one is actually translated by myself. Sometimes she's too slow, she's very busy. She's not employed by myself. The idea would be that the poet would employ a translator, and having a full-time translator would be a dream. So sometimes I do it myself, and it's never as good as Claire's translations. This is a self-portrait, and it's called Self-Portrait on an Airplane. Bent like an embryo, flung into a narrow seat, I try to recall the smell of a freshly mowed hay when wooden carts come down in August from the mountain meadows on slippery path, and the coachman screams the way men always scream in the moments of panic. They yelled like that already in the Iliad and never fell silent, neither during the Crusades nor later, much later, near us, when no one paid attention. I'm tired. I think of things, excuse me, the climate is not good. I'm tired. I think of things that cannot be thought, of the silence which reigns in the forest when birds fall asleep, of the end of the summer that comes near. I hold my head in my hands, as if I tried to protect it from distraction. Seen from the outside, I may seem almost lifeless, immobile, resigned, inviting compassion. But this is not true. I'm free, perhaps even happy. Yes, I do hold in my hands my heavy head, but in it a poem is just being born. So now in Polish, I know there's a handful of people who will understand it. Autoportret w samolocie. Skulony jak embrion, wtłoczony w ciasny fotel, próbuję sobie przypomnieć zapach świeżo skoszonego siana, kiedy drewniane wozy zjeżdżają w sierpniu z górskich łąk, ślizgając się na polnych drogach, i woźnica krzyczy głośno, tak jak zawsze krzyczą mężczyźni w chwilach paniki. Już w Iliadzie tak wrzeszczeli i nigdy potem nie zamilkli, ani w czasie wypraw krzyżowych, ani później, dużo później, bliżej nas, kiedy nikt ich nie słuchał. Jestem zmęczony, myślę o tym, o czym nie da się myśleć, o ciszy, jaka panuje w lesie, kiedy zasnęły już ptaki, o zbliżającym się końcu lata. Trzymam głowę w dłoniach, jakbym chciał ją uchronić od zniszczenia. Widziany z zewnątrz mogę się zapewne wydawać nieruchomy, nieomal martwy, zrezygnowany, godny współczucia. Ale to nieprawda. Jestem wolny, może nawet szczęśliwy. Tak, trzymam w dłoniach moją ciężką głowę, lecz w niej właśnie rodzi się wiersz. Now this is another self-portrait. This is a tiny little poem, and this one translated by Claire or not? No, this also by myself. But I think no, translated by Claire. It's this one is called Self-Portrait in a Museum. A swarthy Christ gazed at me from small Trecento paintings. I didn't understand his look, but wanted to receive it. A dark-haired Christ, intense, completely focused, framed in Byzantine gold, watched me, while my attention lay elsewhere. With growing animus, I observed the elderly French pair. In the gallery, nearly empty, he read to her, aloud, too loud, from the proper page in the brochure. I read another self-portrait, this time from the book, from Eternal Enemies. But when you read self-portrait from a book with a title like this, you think you are your own eternal enemy, which is certainly true. This one is called Self-Portrait Not Without Doubts. And it's translated by, certainly, by Claire Kavanagh. Enthusiasm moves you in the morning. By evening, you lack the nerve even to glance at the blackened page. Always too much or too little. Just like those writers who sometimes bother you, some so modest, minimal, and underread that you want to call out, "Hey friends, courage! Life is beautiful. The world is rich and full of history." Others, proud and serious, are distinguished by their erudition. "Gentlemen, you too must die someday," you say, in thought. The territory of truth is plainly small, narrow as a path about a cliff. Can you stick to it? Perhaps you've strayed already. Do you hear laughter or apocalyptic trumpets? Perhaps both. A dissonance, ungodly grating, a knife that skates along the glass and whistles gladly. There's this poem. I was once invited in Krakow to the commencement of the academic year at the theater school. And I don't need to explain anything, but there was a Diction teacher who was retiring. So it was a small but a moving episode. So this poem is called "The Diction Teacher Retires from the Theater School." Tall, shy, dignified in an old-fashioned way, she bids farewell to students, faculty, and looks around suspiciously. She's sure they will mangle their mother tongue ruthlessly and go unpunished. She takes the certificate. She'll check for errors later. She turns and vanishes off stage in the spotlight's velvet shadows, in silence. We are left alone to twist our tongues and lips. Maybe not. This is a poem written for Joseph Brodsky, the great Russian poet. And it's the title of the poem is Subject Brodsky. And I mentioned the place, the city where he was born. He was born in Leningrad. Subject Brodsky. Please note, born in May in a damp city, hence the motif, water, soon to be surrounded by an army whose officers kept Hölderlin in their backpacks, but, alas, they had no time for reading, too much to do. Tone, sardonic, despair, authentic, always en route, from Mexico to Venice, lover and crusader who campaigned ceaselessly for his unlikely party. Name Poetry versus the Infinite, or PVI if you prefer abbreviations. In every city and in every port he had his agents. He sometimes sang his poems before an avid crowd that didn't catch a word. Afterwards, exhausted, he would smoke a Gauloise on a cement embankment, gulls circling overhead as if above the Baltic, back home. Vast intelligence, favorite topic, time versus thought, which chases phantoms, revives Mary Stuart, Daedalus, Tiberius. Poetry should be like horse racing, wild horses with jockeys made of marble. An unseen finish line lies hidden in the clouds. Please remember irony and pain. The pain had lived long inside his heart and kept on growing, as though each elegy he wrote adored him obsessively and wanted him alone to be its hero. But, ladies and gentlemen, your patience, please, we are nearly through. I don't know quite how to put it. Something like tenderness, the almost timid smile, the momentary doubt, the hesitation, the tiny pause in flawless arguments. This poem actually grew out of a line from Conrad Aiken's poetry, and the line is, "Music I heard with you was more than music." So the poem is called Music Heard with You. Music heard with you will stay with us always. Grave Brahms and elegiac Schubert, a few songs, Chopin's Fourth Ballad, a few quartets with heart-breaking chords, Beethoven, Adagios, the sadness of Shostakovich, who didn't want to die, the great choruses of Bach's Passions, as if someone had summoned us, demanding joy, pure and impartial, joy in which faith is self-evident. Some scraps of Lutosławski, as fleeting as our thoughts. A black woman singing blues ran through us like shining steel, though it reached us on the street of an ugly, dirty town. Mahler's endless marches, the trumpet's voice that opens the Fifth Symphony and the first part of the Ninth. You sometimes call him Mahler. Mozart's despair in the Requiem, his buoyant piano concertos. You hummed them better than I did, but we both know that music heard with you will grow still with us. You know, malheur is, in French, means disaster. So my wife is not as enthusiastic of Gustav Mahler as I am. So she tries to spoil my pleasure, and she calls him sometimes malheur. I should have told you this in advance. I told you about my father. I have here a poem. It's called In a Little Apartment. And this poem grew from something he told me. This was a few years ago, and I asked him, what do you do all day? And he said, I remember. So this is called In a Little Apartment. And the city in which he lives is called Gliwice. It's this city in Silesia. So in the dusty little apartment in Gliwice, in a low block in the Soviet style that says all towns should look like barracks and cramped rooms will defeat conspiracies, where an old-fashioned wall clock marches on, unwearied. He relives daily the mild September of '39, its whistling bombs, and the Jesuit garden in Lvov, gleaming with the green glow of maples and ash trees and small birds. Kayaks on the Dniester, the scent of wicker and wet sand, the hot day when you met a girl who studied law. The trip by freight car to the west, the final border. 200 roses from the students grateful for your help in '68. And other episodes I will never know. The kiss of a girl who didn't become my mother. The fear and sweet gooseberries of childhood. Images drawn from that calm abyss before I was. Your memory works in the quiet apartment. In silence, systematically, you struggle to retrieve for an instant your painful century. Maybe now a few poems from a different book, just for little entertainment. This is a poem, not a very old one. It's called The Polish Biographical Dictionary in a Library in Houston. Maybe I read it here last time. Who remembers? Who knows? And you know that in every decent country there's a biographical dictionary, which is a very solid piece of work. There are many historians who collaborate with it. And mostly this is a very slow work. It just takes ages. And I think for all these biographical dictionaries, there's a principle that you only write about somebody who already died. You have to wait for the entry has to be full, so to speak, because who knows, somebody can change in his last years, right? Or you wait for the final moment. And also, to understand this poem, it appears in installments, and so I think that now in my poem it reaches the letter S. I think it may have reached the letter T after I've written this poem, after I wrote this poem. Okay, and there are several names that have, people who have entries in this, but you don't need to worry about that. The one is important is Norwid, who's this 19th century important poet. The Polish Biographical Dictionary in a library in Houston. I discovered this. I knew about this dictionary, of course, but it's also in the Rice Library in Houston. Prince Roman Sangushko treks across Siberia. Joseph Conrad will write a story about him. Near the end of his long life, he founds a library. He dies universally admired. Maria Kalergis, C. Muhanov Maria, alleged ties with the Tsar's secret police. Half her heart is Polish, the other half unknown. Friends with Liszt and Wagner, Chopin's pupil, patriot of the Warsaw Theatre, renegade and patriot by turns. Penniless Norvid fell in love with her, see Norvid, and loved her with all his heart. Julian Klatschko, short, rather heavy-set, high-strung, excitable, no lack of self-esteem. Perhaps the natural son of the ill-famed Pelican, a sparkling stylist, the glory of La Revue des Deux Mondes, worked with the Czartoryskis, then employed by the Austrian ministry. There was no Polish one. He expires in Krakow, paralyzed, already dead. Still more shadows, A to S. This dictionary cannot be completed. This is your country, your laconism, your indifference, and your emotion. So much life for just one homeland, so much death for just one dictionary. I see I'm getting a little morbid with all these things. But, all thinkers and poets agree. Didn't Plato say that philosophy is a practice of death? The poetry is not very different. But this poem, again, is a little morbid. It's called Opus Posthumus. It doesn't need much explanation. It's again Gustav Mahler, who I absolutely adore as a composer, unlike my wife, as you know. I quote one word from, one of his great works is Song of the Earth, Das Lied von der Erde, and it ends on the word ewig. The words, this is, he actually uses German translations of Chinese poems. It's very, very strange, but the poems are beautiful and the music is just divine. So if you don't know the Song of the Earth, just don't wait. Opus Posthumus. The train stopped in a field. The sudden silence startled even sleep's most ardent partisans. The distant lights of shops or factories glittered in the haze like the yellow eyes of wolves. Businessmen on trips stooped over their computers, totting up the day's losses and gains. The stewardess poured coffee steeped in bitterness. Ewig, ewig, last word, song of the earth. It repeats so often. Remember how we listened to this music, to the promise that we so longed to believe. We don't know if we are still in Holland. This may be Belgium now. No matter. An early winter evening, and the earth hid beneath thick streaks of dusk. You could sense the presence of a canal's black water, unmoving, stripped of mountain currents' joy, and the great amazement of our oceans. Wolves' yellow eyes were quivering with a nervous neon light, but no one feared an Indian attack. The train stopped at that moment when our reason starts to stir, but the soul, its noble yearning, is asleep. We are listening at different time to Schubert, that posthumous quintet where despair declares itself insistently, intently, almost insatiably, renewing its assault on the indifference of the genteel concert hall, ladies in their furs, and the reviewers, minor envoys of the major papers. And once, out walking, midnight, summer in the country, a strange sound stopped us short, snorting and neighing of unseen horses in a pasture, as though the night laughed happily to itself. What is poetry if we see solitude? What is salvation if there is no thread? Posthumous quintet. Only music keeps on growing after death, music and the hair of trees, as if rivers gave ecstatic milk and honey, as if dancer danced in frenzy once again. And yet we are not alone. One day some guitar, worn by time, will start singing for itself alone. And the train moves at last. The earth rocks underneath its stately weight, and slowly Paris draws close with its golden aura, its gray doubt. Maybe I'll read another poem in Polish. This is a very new poem which has no translation. This is just a little present for those lucky ones who understand Polish. It's the title of the poem is I Dreamed of My City. Śniło mi się moje miasto. Śniło mi się moje dawne miasto. Mówiło językiem dzieci i pokrzywdzonych. Przemawiało różnymi głosami, śpiesząc się i przekrzykując, jak prości ludzie postawieni nagle przed obliczem wyższego urzędnika. Nie ma sprawiedliwości, wołało. Wszystko nam odebrano. Skarżyło się głośno. O nas nikt nie pamięta, naprawdę nikt. Widziałem feministki o czarnych oczach. Tłoczyli się szlachcice zapomnianych herbów, sędziowie w togach uszytych z pokrzyw i pobożni, zmęczeni Żydzi. Ale wolno, nieubłaganie nadchodził szary świt i mówcy matowieli, gaśli, posłuszni wracali do koszar jak pułki ołowianych żołnierzyków. I wtedy usłyszałem też zupełnie inne słowa, a jednak są cuda. Nie wszyscy wierzą, ale zdarzają się cuda. I budząc się, powoli, opornie wychodząc z bunkra tego snu, zrozumiałem, że tam jeszcze trwają spory, jeszcze nic nie jest rozstrzygnięte. This poem, this is a new poem, and the title is Improvisation. You must take up the world's whole weight and make it easier to bear. Toss it like a knapsack on your shoulders and set out. The best time is evening in spring, when trees breathe calmly and the night promises to be fine. Elm twigs crackle in the garden. The whole weight, blood and ugliness, can't be done. A trace of bitterness will linger on your lips, and the contagious despair of the old woman you spotted in the tram. Why lie? After all, rapture exists only in imagination and leaves quickly. Improvisation, always just improvisation, great or small, that's all we know. In music, as a jazz trumpet weeps happily, or when you stare at the blank page, or try to outwit sorrow by opening a favorite book of poems. Just then the phone usually rings, someone asking, "Would you like to try the latest model?" "No, thank you, I prefer the proven brands." Grayness and monotony remain. Grief, the finest elegy can't heal. But perhaps there are things hidden from us in which sorrow and enthusiasm mix non-stop on a daily basis, like the dawn's birth along the seashore. No, wait, like the laughter of those little altar boys in white vestments on the corner of St. John and Mark. Remember? Maybe two more, and I will slowly land. When I visited once Zbigniew Herbert, the poem whose poem I read in the beginning, in Paris, he was gravely ill but never lost his sense of humor, and he was rising from a sofa very heavily, and he said, "Look, earlier I would get up like a Boeing, now just like an Antonov." This poem is called Vita Contemplativa, which is the Latin, but I think it's easy to understand. This is the Contemplative Life. And it's set in Berlin. It's actually, I said in the poem, it's sort of set in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which is, at least it was last year, it was still not painted. So it was the last dark building from the communist times in the middle of Berlin. And I'm afraid they may paint it soon, because it fitted my poem perfectly. This suit, Vita Contemplativa. It may already be September. I drank tasteless coffee in the cafe garden of the Museum Insel and thought about Berlin, its dark waters, black buildings that have seen so much. But peace reigns in Europe. Diplomats doze. A pale sun, the summer dies serenely. Spiders weave its shining shroud. The plane trees' dry leaves write memoirs of their youth. So this is the Vita Contemplativa. The black walls enclosing white sculptures. The bust of a Greek beauty. So this is it, an altar before which no one prays. So this is the Vita Contemplativa. Narcissus, a Roman copy of a Greek boy on prosthetic limbs of bronze, a veteran of which war. Then a Kouros with his pouch of testes, a vanished phallus. We seem to occupy a desert island. Time moves deliberately without haste. Helpless rapture. So this is the Vita Contemplativa. Bliss, an instant with no hour, as the poet said, the poet killed in Lublin by a bomb. But what if this or a different city, the Vita Activa, surged again? What would Artemis, 4th century BCE, do then? Hermes, Narcissus, parchment faces stare at me with envy. I still make mistakes, they can't. Comparing day and night, so this is it. Sleep and waking, mind and world, this is it. Joy, tranquility, thought, attention, the levitating heart. Loosened thoughts smolder in black walls, so this is it. What is it? We don't know. We dwell in the abyss, in dark waters, in brightness. And I will end with another self-portrait written in May this year. And this is called Self-Portrait 08. Maybe I'll change the title when the 09 arrives, because the poet will seem old by then. Self-Portrait 08. Keeps growing older, frayed suits, reads a lot, sometimes vanishes in books like Indians in trackless jungles, repeats himself. It all repeats. Yellow notebook in his pocket, music's summons. Evening he moves to the window in a rumpled shirt and yawns. looks a little different in every picture. His father's face invades his own slightly melancholy face. The short, white beard, his enemies insist, must signify capitulation. The eyes gaze at the lens with hope. Growing older, likes water, flat, sleepy rivers, and the green ocean. When swimming, his body disappears in the dark currents as if temporarily testing another mode of being. The wind takes his breath. Night bestows absolute peace. The only absolute we've got, a friend, scoffs. They've been arguing for a decade now. A citizen, he thinks of his injured country, the garden of childhood that never was. Takes lots of trips. April and Belgrade, the pockmarks of a recent war. The swollen Danube calls to mind its carefree early years in Germany. Jerusalem in May, more traces of war, but holiness drifts above the legendary city like the scent of magnolias. A journalist's questions seem unkindly familiar. Strangeness grows. Always the same, early breakfast, after lunch a long stroll. Slowly becoming a fixed object. Dreams drag him below. Dawn deftly rescues him. But this is I, still I, ever searching and shapeless. Always I. Every morning opens a shining new chapter and can't finish it. This is I on the street, at the station. I hearing a child's cry, students laughing, a starling's shriek. The I of ignorance, of uncertainty, of desire, expectation, and wild joy. I who understands nothing, answers insults, wavers, tries to start fresh, guards himself in conversations, in despair, in learned debates. This is I, bored, resigned, unhappy, haughty. This is I, daydreaming like a 12-year-old, deathly worn like an old man. I, in the museum, at the seaside, in Krakow's main square, yearning for a moment that doesn't want to come, that hides like mountain peaks on cloudy afternoons. Illumination finally arrives, and I suddenly know all. I know that it's not me. Thank you.